So, we want to start? Okay. So, at first, nice to meet you again. It's an honor for me to deliver this lecture today. My name is Mattia De Rocca, and I teach general psychology and special pedagogy at the med school at the University of Rome Vergata. And I also taught some STEM disciplines related to cognitive science and neuroscience here at CIEE. Today I would like to talk about the Maria Montessori Method and the Reggio Emilia approach in the light of contemporary cognitive science. I think that this is very important because I will try to make a historical contextualization in order to understand one fact that can sound weird, and that is the fact that Maria Montessori and Loris Malaguzzi, the founder of the Montessori Method and Reggio Emilia approach, here in Italy, they are completely underestimated. We don't talk about these methods, we don't apply a lot of these methods, notwithstanding the fact that both these two methods are being elaborated and implemented for the first time here in Italy. I think that this is a bonus, this is something that is just bad. And in order to start this lecture, I would like to quote Leitner Whitmer, the founding father of clinical psychology, American clinical psychology and clinical psychology at large, when he wrote that he believes that there is not a distinction between a pure science and an applied one. The pure and the applied sciences advance on a single front. What retards the progress of one retards the progress of others. What fosters one fosters the other. This phrase was written down in 1907, and I think that this is a lesson that we forgot in a way, especially here, because the main reason behind this denial of the value of the Reggio Emilia approach and the Montessori method is connected to the fact that in Italy and maybe in Europe at large, we think that pedagogy is just an applied discipline. It's not something that we can use in order to advance the pure science, the theoretical science. And this has several backlashes on the development of pedagogical science. For example, the fact that it's very difficult to collect fundings for the development of pedagogical science. And in fact, this sounds even more weird because both Maria Montessori and Loris Malaguzzi were two revolutionaries in a way. Let's stay for a while on the figure of Maria Montessori. She was one of the first women who graduated in medicine in Italy, and this is the known part of her history, of her story. The fact is that she was also the woman behind the development of physical anthropology, for example, anthropometry, measuring the human being on a scientific basis. And for example, she worked with Sergio Sergi and with the founding fathers of Italian neurology at the beginning of the century. She also had a very strange and peculiar personal story. She was obliged to abandon her child because she had this son from the relationship she had with her boss, and in Italy during the first half of the 20th century, this was considered a reason for being kicked out of academia and from also the medical profession. Nevertheless, she was a brave woman. She was the first woman to to deliver a speech in front of the first International Congress on Child Development, saying that education until that moment was just was relying on a mistake or a misunderstanding about what a child was, what children are. And the same is true in a way for Loris Malaguzzi, even if he lived and worked in the second half of the 20th century. He wasn't even interested, actually, in the beginning, in practical education. For a moment, he also thought to take an academic path, an academic career. But he had one strong political reason behind his action and behind the work that today we know as the Reggio Emilia approach. Because you have to understand that the Reggio Emilia region, the Emilia-Romagna region in Italy, was a region that was completely devastated by World War II. In fact, the Nazis had set the line for the occupation of Italy exactly in that region, and for a couple of years we had this, fake state, the Repubblica di Salò, the Republic of Salò, that was ruled by fascists and Nazis, and Emilia-Romagna was the region where many massacres and homicides, political homicides, took place. And Malaguzzi had one idea: we have to rebuild this country. And he started to think that he had to rebuild the country starting from education. So, two pioneers, two revolutionaries, and nevertheless, we think that they were just, amateur of science, notwithstanding the fact that Maria Montessori had 3 degrees. The first one in medicine, but then she took a master, the equivalent of a master's degree in philosophy, and she also was, she created the establishment of education training here in Italy, in which she founded, not officially, but she founded one of the first schools that was aimed to provide education for those who want to become a teacher. Okay. And on the other hand, apart from these two figures, I don't want to today. I don't want to highlight differences or similarities between the two methods. Dr. Bledi has provided to you a class that has given you the possibility to study the methods. I just want to compare the works of these two scientists, these two authors and philosophers in a way, with what we today call the 4E approach to cognition, the new cognitive sciences. Cognitive science is an umbrella term that we use in order to gather together the advances in psychology, neuroscience, philosophy of mind, and so on, every discipline that is related to the mind. And as you probably know, neuroscience and cognitive science have been at the center of the Western scientific panorama. Neuroscience and the science of the mind are considered the frontier, the new frontier of the science. Think about, for example, in your country, in the United States, the BRAIN initiative that fostered the development of new technologies for investigating the brain. There has been also another kind of initiative here in Europe, the Human Brain Project. We as a culture, the Western culture, the Atlantic culture, civilization, started to think at the end of the 80s that the next goal was to conquer the secrets of the mind and the brain. Okay, and these kind of revolutionary public feelings about brain and mind was accompanied by another revolution that was the development of a new approach to brain and mind. Until the 80s, we thought about the brain and the mind as hardware and software of a computer. Okay, the so-called computational approach. Computational approach has a lot of philosophical implications. For example, one of the main implications of thinking of the brain as a computer is the fact that I can think that all my cognition, my emotions, my mental life is just inside my brain. It's just inside my skull. Okay? I don't need anything. If the brain is the mind and the brain works like a computer, I can just rely on the cells that compose my brain. But then we started to see that this kind of model, this kind of paradigm, this is called a paradigm in philosophy of science, is a main theoretical model, wasn't useful at all. And we started to think that we had to get back to practical knowledge, including pedagogy, including education, in order to understand how the mind works, how the mind actually works. Okay? And we developed this framework, this theoretical framework that is called the 4E approach to cognition. What are these 4 E's? Embodiment, and action, embedment, and extension. I'm gonna elucidate step by step all of these E's. And of course, when we talk about, especially about the Montessori method, we have to start from embodiment. Just one little divertissement. I have taken the vast majority of quotations from Montessori from this book that is The Secret of Children. I think that the translation in English is this one. For Malaguzzi, I selected the quotation from several works of him, and especially from an interview that was published in English in the United States in the 90s. I have the PDF, the electronic file for the book, if you want to have a copy of it. Okay. So let's start with embodiment. What is the embodied approach to cognition? Is the idea that the body plays both a causal and constitutive role in the development of cognition. It refers to the idea that the mind depends on the involvement of the body in order to shape the properties and the specific features of what we call cognition. Okay? Why am I saying that if I want to connect Montessori and the Reggio Emilia approach to cognitive science, I have to start from the body? Well, there is actually a epistemic reason, a philosophical reason behind this. I don't know if you are a Christian, probably maybe you remember how the Gospel of John starts. In the beginning, it was the Word. Okay, we, with the Western civilization, always had a passion for words, for language. Language has always seen as the clear distinction between humans and other animals, and so we magnified language as the top of the most advanced and complex of our cognitive functions. Okay, I just want to make another quote. I came from philosophy studies, so I use a lot of citation. I will not be boring. This is a quotation from the Faust, from Goethe. He wrote in Anfang nach die Tat. In the beginning, it was the action. What does it mean with these? Why did I select these specific quotation? Because we started to think that the sensory motor possibilities of a body was indeed the starting point from reflecting on on cognition. Just think about this phrase by Maria Montessori. She wrote, "The hand is the fine organ, complicated in its structure, which allows intelligence not only to manifest itself, but to enter into special relationships with the environment. Man, it can be said, takes possession of the environment with his hand." You know, there is a correct, a very old debate in Western tradition. For example, Aristotle, one of the founding fathers of Western philosophy, wrote that we have the hands because we are the most intelligent species. Anaxagoras, another Greek philosopher of the 5th century before the Common Era, wrote exactly the contrary. He wrote that we are so intelligent because we have hands. Anaxagoras started from the body, and Maria Montessori did the same. There was a reason for that. Maria Montessori came from a very specific tradition of thinking that was founded by Jean-Gaspard Itard. He was a neurologist and a psychiatrist in 18th century, working in 18th century in Paris, in France. He was the first neurologist starting to think that in education the body had a role that was more important than we thought previously. And Maria Montessori was the apex to the top of this kind of thought in both medicine and education. And this is, in a way, very similar to what Loris Malaguzzi wrote down in 1983 when talking about the 100 languages of children. He said that the first language that we had to highlight in order to understand its importance was the motor language. It's the first language that we know even before actually we started to develop a verbal language. And for example, he wrote that experience still confirms that children need many freedoms: freedom to investigate, try, make mistakes, correct, to appreciate the infinite resources of hands, sight, and hearing, shapes, materials, sounds, and color. The sensorimotor part of our organism was at the center of, at least a part of the Reggio Emilia approach and reflection behind it. Okay, so I work inside this conceptual framework. I came from an embodied cognition, and this is something that is very important to me. And I think that we should, again, even if nowadays embodied cognition is an approach that I think it's quite accepted from the community of also psychologists and neuroscientists. But it is important to understand that this is not only a philosophical connection that we can make in academia. Think about the early years of a child. This is something that Jean Piaget said for the first time. I guess that you have already studied Piaget, Jean Piaget. The first stage in his stage theory is the sensorimotor one. What does it mean? It means that a human being, every animal actually, but a human being starts to know the environment, starts to know the world by also random, in a way, sensorimotor actions in the world. He moves in the room and he starts to feel that if you touch the wall with too much power, too much strength, he can be hurt from his action. And okay, this is the easy part. This is quite clear. We know at first things by movement, but there is something more. For example, there is the fact that we start with 7 neonatal reflexes, and by a delicate interplay of accommodation and assimilation, we start to create several patterns of action. For example, this is one of the most important reflexes in a newborn child, the prehension reflex. And we, starting by these simple reflexes, you can take every kind of child in the world, put something in his or her hand, and he will grab. We start to understand the difference between a strong grasp and a fine grasp, that eventually will become the main motor tools in order to do one of the most important human behavior, that is reading and writing. So, this was again a focus on movement, but think about the whole sensory motor possibilities that we have. Okay, probably you know what object permanence is. That is the main reason why we love to go to little children and play peekaboo, because they are astonished and surprised every time we reappear. Okay? According to Piaget, object permanence is acquired at the end of the sensorimotor stage, and these can be, if we take object permanence as a simple function, we cannot understand how, starting from a sensorimotor behavior, sensorimotor action, very simple, we can develop higher cognitive functions. Object permanence is something that we should value in a very different way. Just think about the fact that starting from the acquisition of object permanence, for example, we start to think that the world doesn't overlap with ourselves. The world is something different from us. And if the world is something different from us, this means that eventually I will try to understand that other people, actually, when I'm a child, I don't know what a person is, I don't know what people are, but I can understand that there are animals like me, they resemble me, they seem like me, they look like me. And probably they also have a mind like me. Starting from object permanence, I start to understand that I have also, there are also other people around me. Eventually, around 3 years old, from object permanence, we start to develop what is called the theory of mind. Theory of mind is what we can test with the Serian test. I guess that you know it. This is something that I am really fascinated by the area and the scientific evidence of this test. And if you know, Samuel Cohen is the brother of Sasha, and one of the most distinguished scholars in the field of autism, also Leslie and Fried, both Utah and her husband. They developed this test, but I think that you already know it, so I can avoid to explain this. But it is important to understand that the ability that we have to reflect on the fact that Anne doesn't, that Sally doesn't know what Anne knows, is a direct consequence of the development of object permanence. So from a sensorimotor behavior, we can develop higher cognitive functions that, for example, is responsible for our ability to lie. It's very important to understand. This starts from a simple sensorimotor ability, that is, I know that if I turn myself, the other people in the room just stay here. They still exist. Okay. Let's turn to another E of the 4 E's that we mentioned at the beginning, and let's move to embedment. Embedded cognition refers to the value of environment because in a way it is implied within embodied cognition. Okay, if I focus the role of my body, of the organism body in the environment, I have to highlight also the role of the environment. Of course, environment here has to be meant as not exclusively the physical environment. Okay, for our species, the environment is always physical, social, and cultural. Embedded cognition holds the idea that cognition is constrained by ongoing interaction, a continuous interplay between body and environment, emphasizing this relationship between ourselves and artifacts, contextual factors, and cognitive process. Again, this was something that is at the very core of both the two pedagogical approaches that we are talking about, the Montessori Method and the Reggio Emilia approach. This phrase of Montessori is probably one of the most famous. Our method of educating the child is characterized precisely by the central importance given to the environment. And this is something that you can easily look at if you visit a Casa dei Bambini. When in 1907 Maria Montessori established the first Casa dei Bambini, the children's house, she put for the very first time an extreme importance in the design of the environment. This is something, yesterday I was with a colleague of mine, and we were talking about the lecture, today's lecture, and she is a clinical psychologist, but she has also an interest toward the language and education. And she said, it's a shame that Maria Montessori here in Italy is remembered exclusively as the woman that designed the tiny desks. It's true. It's true. But there's something that I think it's very important. I don't know if in Italian there is an expression that is tenere qualcuno sulle ginocchia, getting someone on your knees. Maybe it's also in English. The Beatles sang this in 1964. Children on your knees. Why do you have to take children on your knees? This is the beginning of this book. Maria Montessori said there is one reason, and it's a terrible one. Is the fact that we just don't care about children. We don't care about the environment. We build a world that is exclusively meant for other people. This is not something that just came out of the blue. During the Middle Age, if you look at the art of Middle Age, how are depicted the children, like little men, small men. And they were something that has, I'm a child, I have to wait until he is a teen in order to make him or her work. It was just a period that was a sort of limbo, okay? And even if Maria Montessori is remembered as the woman that created the tiny desks, the fact is that in the development of the environment that they would call Casa dei Bambini, she had a wonderful insight, because she understood that in the active relationship with the environment, children had the possibility to develop proper functions. In a way, she also predated the work of Jean Piaget. This is something that in the history of psychology is very debated, because, for example, we found some letters that Maria Montessori wrote in 1908, so a dozen years before the most important writings of Jean Piaget, where she already wrote down the fact that if I use this kind of structure in a house of bambini, a child can start to develop the idea of categorization, for example. It's not just about ordering things, it's about making a category of something. And something similar also was at the core of the reflection of Loris Malaguzzi, when he said that we, the Reggio Emilia teachers, think that the space should be a kind of aquarium where the ideas, values, attitudes, and cultures of the people who live in it are reflected. The use of the concept of an aquarium is not a random one. In Italian, there is this specific nuance of the concept of fishes living in the sea. This is something that you are completely at ease with. And for example, when you take a look at an atelier, a Reggio Emilia atelier, you can see that actually it is not a house. A house is something that is meant to be, a place where a family can rest. Here there is a sort of fluidity in the development of several spaces. There is the possibility to change spaces in order to, for example, foster specific educational projects during the year. And there are specific parts of the atelier that are devoted, for example, to discovery of nature, or for example, for taking on physical activities, and of course the artistic ones that are at the core of Malaguzzi's method. This has a very strong connection to what we have highlighted and discovered. Discovery is the right word. In the last 2 decades, within cognitive science, when we started to think about something that actually we already know, we knew, but now we have a new evidence in order to make the argument for enriched environments a scientific one. What is an enriched environment? It is a combination, Rosenweig said, of complex inanimate and social stimulation that are present in a specific environment, and the specific ability that an enriched environment has is its capacity to modify behavior, especially when tasks require complex cognitive functions. And of course, this is related to a concept that was developed for the first time in its contemporary version by Donald Hebb when he wrote in 1959 in the organizational behavior that neurons that fire together, wire together, the Hebb law. And this is the basic tenet of brain plasticity. When you expose a child to an environment that is rich of stimuli, he will start to associate those different stimuli in the creation, the building of specific neural networks. After all, think about it. The both of you want to become a teacher, educator. It's true? No? You are. Okay. Think about the way by which we learn children to write. We do something that for an adult is very strange. We oblige children to do this. A for very long. What is the reason for this? The reason is that neurons that wire together, and in order to gain literacy, I have to make several parts of my brain connect at the same time. On the temporal lobe, what is related to hearing, the occipital lobe, the visual cortex, I have to understand, I have to break symmetries and recognize new shapes that have been made by man. It is important to understand that we haven't the time to evolve by natural selection in order to acquire the literacy. Okay, it's something that we have to reinvent every time we teach a child how to write. And then I have to also implicate motor skills. A, B, it's very complex. Think about the fact that human beings are, the Homo sapiens and other two species have to learn language from imitation. And it's not easy at all to understand that, for example, naturality and easiness, the association between the motor pattern that has to be connected to a specific phoneme. For example, I apologize for my English. I lived in France for a while, and I studied French from since I was a child. So, for example, for me, it's quite easy to parler avec ces termes-là. Okay? But just because during my period of relation, I was used to, I got used to okay? Unfortunately, I don't have to write it. There is, however, I was talking about it a few minutes ago. Excuse me for my digression. There is one scientific evidence that came from the new cognitive sciences that in a way strengthened this kind of reflection, and this evidence came from the field of epigenetics. Do you know what epigenetics is? It's the study of how behaviors and relationship with the environment can modify the expression of our DNA without altering DNA. And this was a surprise at the beginning. Why I put the image of some mice here. I had the privilege to work with one of the most important and distinguished neuroscientists here in Italy, Montessori. He is the head of the neuroscience department at the Scuola Normale Superiore of Pisa. He is considered he's a very old man actually. I think he retired last year. But he's a brilliant genius here. And in Italy he is known because of some experiments he led on the epigenetic changes in mice in relationship to the presence of the absence of maternal bonding. Maternal bonding is the bonding that a mother has in respect to her children, and we knew from experience, from everyday knowledge, for folk science, folk psychology, that if I take a child and take him or her away from his or her mother, he or she will suffer something. For example, he will be more inclined to depression or antisocial behavior. But this was an inference we made from experience. Montessori had this brilliant idea to look at the level of serotonin and dopamine, the expression, the genetic expression of serotonin and dopamine in mice that were allowed to stay with their mother, and in something other mice that were not allowed to do this. And it's important to understand that, especially in the early years of life, we can suffer from very striking and important and deep modifications of the way by which our genes code for protein and hormones and neurotransmitters if we are exposed to a social enriched environment or hormones. And this is important because I want to remember that Maria Montessori had the bravery to fight for this point in 1922, not 2022. Just a century ago, she said exactly this. The absorbent mind absorbs from the environment, the complexity of the environment. She wrote, and she also said a lot of times that every time you take away a a child from an environment that is something more of what he or she expects to be, you are just putting the child into a cage. Also, these words are not casual at all. Maria Montessori was a heroine in destroying the concept that special people with special needs or disabilities have to stay confined into asylums. Okay, this is very important. And I really would like to talk to you about what the legacy of Maria Montessori in this specific sense. In 1978 here in Italy we passed a bill that is the Basaglia law, and Italy was the first country to close asylums, and to abolish special classes, special schools. And apart from my academic work, I worked with children with special needs. I worked with them since I am 18. I started studying. I paid my university fees by working especially with people with autism. And unfortunately, or luckily, I don't know how my mother does a similar work. She's a therapist of neuropsychomotricity and neuropsychomotor skills. I don't know what kind of profession can be considered similar in the United States. He's a health operator in Italy. It's just like a medical doctor, but she works. This figure is devoted exclusively to the right to foster the right development of sensorimotor skill in the child. Okay, and I saw 2 times. The first one when I was a little boy. When I was a kid, I was 6 years old. I entered an old special school, and it was just like a prison. For real, it was just like a prison with cages. Okay. And another thing that I had the occasion to look at directly with my mother was when I speak French, and my mother, a few years ago, was requested to do some professional education to psychologists and similar professionals similar to her profession in Africa, in the nation of Djibouti. Okay. Djibouti is a very small country in Africa that stays between Ethiopia and Nigeria, so in the middle of civil war, actually, for a very long time. So all refugees just go there, and they try to make an accommodation, a safe accommodation for them. And we went to Djibouti. She needed a translator for. They speak French there. And one day we were asked to go to a small village. It was 4 miles from Djibouti, where a little girl was they needed to have a second opinion. Okay. The girl was 10. When she was 5, she was diagnosed with an illness, a sacred illness. Okay, she was epileptic, and epilepsy is a very cruel pathology in a way, but we have the tools to fight against epilepsy. Barbiturics, lots of neurosurgery, if you want. The treatment for her epilepsy was a little pass of the Quran, the sacred book of Islam, on a piece of goat skin, okay? Just like an exorcism. And since the exorcism didn't work,
the doctor of the village said, oh, the devil is too strong. We have to cage her and put her in a dark room for the rest of her life. When we, I'm crying, I'm gonna cry just thinking about the image. We saw this girl that spent years, 5 years of her life, locked down in a small room, and the only thing that she was able to do was this. The medical doctors with us say she's autistic, and we say no, she's not. She was just completely deprived of the richness of environment. Just never underestimate the role of environment. Environment is something that is very important. It's not just the tiny tasks. Every time I can explore like my sensorimotor possibilities, the environment around me, I can learn something very different. And the environment, in a way, but we are gonna explore this aspect of the cognition in a while. Think about the fact that also the environment says something to you all the time. In a way, there is a French philosopher, Georges Canguilhem, one of the most important philosophers of medicine in Europe. He wrote down that the relationship between a body and a mind and the environment is something that is normative at its core, because every time we explore the environment, we understand what we like and what we don't like. And this is the most important step in the development of cognition. And we can move to the field, the E, that is an activism, an action. An activism is probably one of the, philosophically speaking, it's quite tricky, but I think it's very cool. It is the theory, the idea that cognition arises through the interaction between an organism and the environment, but supporters of an active cognition say that there is no actual difference between perception and action. So can I do something from little Eliza, just did we met before the Tulane program? No, before the Tulane program. Did we met in our life? No, I don't think so. So I think that you have never seen stuffed animals, no? No. Have you a stuffed animal similar to this one?
I have seen.
It's similar, a turtle. You do?
Mm-hmm.
Alex, you do. Everybody has got a stuffed animal, a turtle. You do that already? Oh. Because usually I use it. This is something that I have since I am a kid, because it's a soft and I can do this.
Oh.
Okay. No, don't worry. It doesn't hurt. Usually, people say that I have my experience. I'm not so skilled, but let's try. Please. Thank you. Everything's fine. So we have two hypotheses to understand the fact that you are being able to get shit. Okay. We can think that in your brain there is a computer that has been able to make a precise calculation of the degree, the movements, the angle, by starting from the fact that you can understand that it's a stuffed animal, so this is soft and is something that will fly at a certain velocity, a certain speed in the air. Or we can think that our brain has evolved exactly for making one thing. Make you perceive the world in order to act. These are the two tenets of active cognition. Perception is perceptually guided action, and cognitive structures emerge from this kind of interaction. And activism is very, very important because it has a strong implication on a philosophical level. For example, for the very first time we
destroyed this illusion that subject and the environment were disconnected from each other. And this is something,
Back for a second.
of course,
Thank you. Sorry.
but I'm going to give you the slide. I'm going to give you this presentation, of course. It's just for you. Can I?
Yes.
How does he say, for example, this? He said that the child learns by interacting with his environment, actively transforming his relationships with the world of adults, things, events, and in original forms with peers. In this sense, they participate in the construction of the self and the other of themselves. It's important to reflect upon this because, you know, this is a very constructivist approach to education. It's the way by which we think that by sensing that the perception of the world in a way is also the definition of what we can do in that world, should be considered the basic element for the development of higher cognitive functions. And this is something that you can find also in the work of Maria Montessori, when she said that are the inner sensibilities of the child that guide him or her in the environment, and this guidance creates something that the child will like or will dislike, and in this normative approach to the construction of an environment, of a mental environment, relies, according to Maria Montessori, the development of cognition during the ontological development, the ontogenetic development. So sorry, not ontological. This is another thing. Of course, this is also very related to the concept of affordance, that is a central concept in the ecological approach to mind, developed by Gibson in the 60s. The affordance is what the environment offers to us in terms of possibilities of action. And it is important to understand that, again, cognitive neurosciences, the 21st century, not 21st century, the end of 21st century, cognitive neurosciences have found an evidence for this, and I'm talking, of course, about the neural system. I guess that you have probably heard about them before. Leonardo Fogassi, one of the original, one of the members of the original group that founded the neural system in Padua in 1987 in the Macacus Resus. This is a Macacus brain. Was I really don't understand why Giacomo Pizzolatti and Leonardo Fogassi didn't win the Nobel, but you know how the story began. There was, when you are in a lab with monkeys, there is always one thing that can never miss in that kind of laboratory: peanuts. Okay, because there are monkeys, so you have to spend the time in an agreeable way. And when you do electrocorticography, you have to put a little electrode in the cortex of the animal, or experimental animal. And there was this, he was actually a PhD student. He was in the lab, he had one job, he had to look at the macacus that was on the chair with the electrode. And as every PhD student, he took a peanut and he made this action. And the electrocorticography did. That is the sound that you hear every time there is an activation. So I started to look around. And it's the peanut. And then he took another one. I said, oh God, something is happening. I have to call Professor Rizzolatti. And I discovered this is a wonderful class of neurons, and it's important to understand again an activism. The mirror neuron system is so connected to an activism because he
just make us overcome a bias that we had about the mind, the difference between subject and environment, the difference between sensation and action, perception and action. We thought for centuries that we could find sensory neurons and motor neurons. But mirror neurons are just in the middle. They respond, they activate every time I do an action and every time I see a conspecific of mine that do the same actions. And this is very important because, again, a sensorimotor function stays at the core of what? Of the development of higher cognitive and emotional functions, so just like empathy, for example, not only the theory of mind, but the ability to feel your pain. This is very important in University of Rome La Sapienza and in Tor Vergata, but
Excuse me, this may have stopped recording.
stop, okay.
No, I don't know, it says something.
Okay, that's fine. It's just for us.
Okay.
It was just a souvenir of this day because
Okay.
I don't know if I have to
Okay.
run. I have to run. Excuse me for my digressions. I warned you at the beginning. It's important to understand the fact that, for example, Salvatore Agliodi here at Roma La Sapienza, the first university of Rome, he made this interesting experiment that led him to publish his research that was all against racism. Actually, he said it doesn't matter the color of your skin. If I see somebody that is in trouble, somebody that is in pain, I just feel it. It's not something that is mediated by culture or cognition. I have to use cognition to avoid the feeling of feeling the other pain. Okay, it's cause of complex, but we are gonna face it in a while. For the last E, I have to run because I don't want to borrow you too much. Fourth E, extension. What is extended cognition? Extended cognition states that the human cognitive processes are just out our heads, and they rely on the enactive relationships that we are able to create with the objects in our environment. Of course, again, we have to mean as environment a complex system of both artifacts and human actors. It is important to stress this point because for a very long time we thought about extended cognition as what? As our ability to use tools in order to enhance our cognition. The use of calculators, the use of block notes in order to foster memory, the use of smartphones in order to navigate the environment. I have another story on this, but it's maybe later. But this is the first formulation of the theory by Clark and Chalmers, two important philosophers of mind, temporary philosophers of mind. I can enhance my abilities, my cognitive abilities, by using external tools. But I think that this is something that is just reductive. It's just too naive, too simplistic to say that this is the extension of cognition. Extension lies essentially in human relationships. And I have to cite the Beatles again. I have to get back to the USSR. Because of course I have to cite Lev Semyonovich Vygotsky, father of proximal development. So, and actually I think that speaking about education, we have to take into account the concept of zone of proximal development, the way by which has been refashioned by Woodbrunner and Ross in the 70s, the so-called New Vygotskian. They use this word, scaffolding. Scaffolding, of course, I'm intending to translate it for my Italian students, you know what a scaffold is, and it refers to the tutoring interaction between an adult and a child. And it's important, it's very, very important to understand that this is something that cannot be separated from a sociocultural view of development and education. There is one important quote by Vygotsky. He said that in the cultural development of the child, each function appears twice on two planes, two levels. First, it appears on the social plane, then on the psychological plane. First, it appears between two people in the form of in an intra-psychological category, then within the child as an intra-psychological category. Probably some of you have heard about this position held by Vygotsky, because it's the so-called Vygotsky-Piaget curve on the development of language, because Piaget believed that language just appeared first as an interiorization of I. The child starts to feel I am Mattia, Shannon, Alex, and so on, Jesse, Eliza. And Vygotsky wrote in his memory, the history of Vygotsky. Vygotsky was not so lucky because he was a real follower of Marx, but he lived under Stalin, under Joseph Stalin. And Stalin loved Pavlov because Pavlov had this idea of psychology as a perfect deterministic chain of behavior, and he wrote, we have to educate people to freedom and to emancipation, and he ended his life in a gulag in Siberia. And this is the reason why, for example, we know because his work just since the 70s, when Bernstein and Goldstein flew away in the United States, bringing with them some of his works. Otherwise, we could not have known about him at all. His pupil, Alexander Luria, is more famous, but I'm opening another lesson of history of psychology. And what's important here, however, is the fact that Vygotsky wrote down, Piaget, you are talking about your own child, your own children, not children at all. Have you ever been to Switzerland? Have you ever been to Geneva? There is a neighborhood that is completely inhabited by Piaget family. They are so rich and so important as a family, just like the Starobinsky. They had there is a complete area of the town. This is the Piaget neighborhood. Okay. So, because we say, why, you're not talking about children at all, at large. You're talking about yours. And this is very important because it's important to understand that when a child acquires language, he or she is acquiring the language of his or her societal cluster. Okay? Every time, I didn't read the original quote by Marx and Engels, but it's important to understand that according to Piaget, language is at first something that you use in order to connect with others. Eventually, this language will be metabolized by your mind, and you will start to begin to say, after you, there is also an I. Okay? Why this is so important? This is so important because if we remember the lesson of Piaget, of Vygotsky, excuse me, we can understand one thing that is actually so connected and so important for everybody who is involved in education. We have a responsibility. Because every time we design an environment that is also a social and a cultural one, we are creating possible scaffolds for children's mind. And these kind of scaffolds don't have to be right per se in itself. Do you want one simple, even if dramatic, example of this? The doll test by the Clarks. You know this experiment. This is one of the most brilliant and important experiments in the history of psychology. You talk about this
Today.
Very. So, every time when I am with my students, I can speak freely. It's just ourselves. So in Italy we don't have this kind of problem with racism because there are other forms of racism, especially with people from LGBT community. Okay, it's just because we don't have a lot of black people, and we have a very strong movement starting from the 50s. For example, we never use the word race, not because we are afraid of using the word race, but because we declared as a European scientific community that there is no place for the word race in science. Okay, we are also I'm part of a group of philosophers and biologists that actually asked the President of our Republic to eliminate the word race from Chapter 4 of the Constitution. Because there is this point of the Italian Constitution that says that everybody is equal in front of the law, notwithstanding gender, sexual orientation, or race. And we signed this petition to the President of the Republic saying we should eliminate this word. Race is something that just has no place in science. We don't think about human beings as divided in race. Maybe dogs, not humans. We have all the same DNA. Okay. And nevertheless, we know perfectly the tragic outcomes of racism. I'm sorry to say that, especially in our country, what we are saying. What we have seen last year with the George Floyd, the rise of the movement is something that should we think about what? Do you remember what I said before about environment, about extension environment and activism perception is action? Do you think that if I am a white person or a black person walking in a street in the United States, I feel the same? No. What is this? Interjection. I don't have the possibility to make another lesson. I don't have the time. I don't want to bore you to that. But for example, there is another important philosopher and psychiatrist in Europe. Actually, it wasn't European. It was from Antille, a colony of France. His name was Frantz Fanon. Frantz Fanon is considered the most important black psychiatrist and psychologist in the European tradition. He wrote in a seminal work that is called White Masks, Black Skin. He said, do you understand what kind of subtle effect racism had on black people? They put in the outside, in the environment, the blame to be black, and we internalize it on our skin. In this way, it's important to understand that this can be understood by the lens of extended cognition. When I put when I change an environment, also on a cultural level, on a social level, on a symbolic level, this environment, according to the law of an active cognition, will become not exclusively a possibility, but also, for example, the declaration for an impossibility, an unavailability. In a way, I will make the rules that are subtly hidden in the environment as a rule inside my mind. This is extended cognition. This is one of the most important implications for extended cognition. When I design an environment for education, I don't have just to put tiny desks. I have to create and build an environment that promotes freedom, actual emancipation, equality for all. This is as a part of extended cognition as the calculators and block notes discussed by Clarks and Chalmers in 2008. Maria Montessori and Loris Malaguzzi had this in mind, not about the issue of racism, of course, but just because of a specificity of the Italian panorama.
But, for example, Maria Montessori had this in mind when he said that the relationship between the adult and the child in a specific environment can lead to conflict that has to be understood as conflict that are expressed as an interplay of actions between the actors that are involved. The adult and the child mate to love each other, live together lovingly, find themselves in a constant struggle over the misunderstanding that corrodes the roots of life and develops into a tangle of actions and reaction. The fact is that Maria Montessori, and I'm going to finish the lesson, had her own personal struggle, not only public one, and her biographers hold different views, different consideration of how this impacted on her. But Lawrence Malaguzzi, when he started to work, he started to develop the Reggio Emilia approach, he had conflict in mind. He knew perfectly what kind of, for example, what kind of education the fascism and the Nazis in Germany had provided, and he started to fight against a specific approach that the educators in Italy held at the time. That was, we just have to teach by not having a conflict. Now we are at peace, and we have to teach children by the law of peace. But he said that, but if you don't have conflict, if you don't create a dialectical movement between the subject and the environment, for example, presenting to the children different possibilities is something that is not necessarily in equilibrium, creating a dialogue, making clear that two individuals can hold different positions, but we can arrange an equilibrium. Well, this is education. This is what we have to do. We have to extend the environment, the possibility. There are 100 languages. These are the 100 languages. When every time I speak with somebody that comes from another culture or from another perspective, that has the color of the skin different from mine, or a sexual orientation that is different from mine, I can learn difference. This is something that that constrain my cognition to compare with the cognition of others, just like scaffolding works, just like proximal developments on work. And this was perfectly, this was something that Lawrence Malaguzzi was perfectly aware of. And this actually is the reason why I think that I think that this is what we do at CIEE. I think that we, during programs like this one, during lectures like this one, we are putting ourselves in dialogue, and in dialogue we can find differences and try to recompose them. And he said to me when I was a student of him, you know, Mattia, every time I'm talking to you, your synapses start to grow and start to make new connections, and sometimes you are overwhelmed by this connection because, for example, when he was in the lab, he was a very rigid man, and sometimes he yelled at us, and he said, yes, this is true, but every time you know the differences, the contrast with me in real life, something is reflected in your brain and in your mind, and tonight with pruning, what will remain in your brain and in your mind tomorrow after the night? The composition, the resolution of conflict. And I think that this kind of dialogue, this kind of intercultural dialogue is what we make here at CIEE. It's something that I hope to have made today also in this lecture. So I want to thank you for this program and this lecture, and thank you for